I suppose a proper review should begin with a spoiler warning. The following review of Bastion contains spoilers for the entire game, so if you haven't played this game before, you've been warned. Bastion released in 2011 from an at the time new developer, Supergiant Games. The purpose of this video is pretty straightforward. Recently I played Bastion for the first time, and I'd like to provide my thoughts on it. Before droning on further, I'll let the game speak for itself.
Proper story is supposed to start at the beginning. Ain't so simple with this one. Now here's a kid whose whole world got all twisted, leaving him stranded on a rock in the sky. He gets up, sets off for the Bastion, where everyone agreed to go in case of trouble. Ground forms up under his feet as it pointing the way. He don't stop to wonder why. Finds his lifelong friend just lying in the road. Well, it's a touching reunion.
Overall, the rippling walls present an elegant first impression of the game and everything it's offering as far as the action is concerned. This first area funnels the player into the game's various mechanics. Movement is telegraphed to you as the stage builds itself around the player character. There's only one place to go. Prompts are small and don't obscure the action or pause the game in any way. The first item the player receives is a melee weapon, signaling the methods and importance of combat right away. Shortly after that, the kid is given a ranged weapon and a shield. The action ramps up to showcase the combat even further. Enemies exist outside of platforms you're able to reach. Enemies can crowd you, making dodging crucial to the combat as well. The game throws everything it has at you in this opening section, but you can't talk about the introduction to this game without talking about the most prominent aspect to it, the narration.
Kid sees the way to the Bastion out the window. It's a bit of a drop.
It's the absolute first thing you hear when starting a new game, even before the game fades up from black. Its dominance in the soundtrack can't be understated since it tends to overpower the score and the sound effects.
He gets a good look at things on his way down. He lands on top of a breaker's bow, and it ain't broke.
Stylistically speaking, the non-diegetic voice is arguably what sets Bastion apart from other narrative-focused action games.
Kid spies a good perch for some target practice. And then he falls to his death. I'm just fooling. He knows he should draw the string all the way back.
A lot of visual media tries to avoid including narration to this degree, for good reasons. This stylistic choice can be seen as patronizing. A show don't tell approach is often preferred, to have stories unfold organically through characters' actions. Sometimes it can be a crutch to pad out weak or unclear stories. It can especially get tiring to hear one voice for such a long time. And if you made it this far in the video, thank you. It's difficult to put all the dramatic weight on a singular actor, even with all the time and budget in the world.
Right back at ya.
In most cases though, voiceover narration is used sparingly because relying on it too much can be a huge risk.
Kid don't go down that easy.
Logan Cunningham's voice is raspy and deep, evoking a blues musician archetype. This complements the musical arrangements, in addition to eschewing a clash with the soundtrack's prominent higher register. Without knowing exactly what it is off the bat, or who he's talking to, you get the idea that he's trying to illustrate something really important, but at the same time there's really no rush. There's also a bit of melancholy thrown in for good measure. This becomes more apparent as the story goes on. For me personally, I never really got tired of it, and I began to wonder why. It didn't occur to me until later on in the game that the narration is mostly reactive. By this I mean it comes after the player does something, not before.
Kid puts him out of his misery.
This is probably the most crucial aspect to the narrator from a gameplay perspective, because for action games specifically, the player is ideally in control at all times.
He steals the city's heart. Might as well.
It avoids the patronizing effect that a narration might unintentionally provide. It's careful not to point you in a particular direction or give you hints that you didn't ask for. The writers and gameplay designers were very cautious not to impress upon the player's actions too often, and it shows, even in these early moments. Completing the tutorial, we see who the narrator actually is. When you meet Rux, he explains that this hub area is known as the titular Bastion. The kid's goal, and thereby the player's goal, is to rebuild the Bastion with the cores collected from the various stages. Among the first structures you rebuild are a distillery or an arsenal, signaling the first sort of RPG-like mechanics for the game. At this point, I had already used the arsenal in the tutorial stage, and considering that I only had 2 weapons and 1 special to choose from, I rebuilt the distillery first. The distillery provides perks in combat, so I was satisfied with my choice. The Workman Ward expands on the tutorial by introducing diverting paths in its level design. Eventually you get a new melee weapon, the machete, and instead of allowing the player to choose whether or not to keep it, it's equipped automatically to its respective weapon slot. This tripped me up initially since I had my ranged weapon equipped to that slot by accident, but the machete thankfully is a nice snappy weapon with a ranged option. I was willing to give the benefit of a doubt considering it's so early in the game when this happens. In retrospect though, it's disappointing to know that one of the game's weaknesses gets showcased in only the 2nd level. The way Bastion handles variety is to throw something new at you in each stage, typically in the form of a new weapon. In the best cases, weapons are best suited for a particular area, however this undermines the autonomy of the player to decide on their playstyle. Especially considering the arsenal is one of the earliest structures you rebuild in the game. Why set up an arsenal at all when a third of it is going to be replaced as you play anyway? This seems like the game's biggest crutch. Since the basic combat is easy enough to grasp, throw a new mechanic at the player so they don't get bored. No 2 stages focus on the same weapon mechanics, which in theory helps to prevent the gameplay from feeling stale. This is where the game's scope reaches its limits. Take Point Lemaine for example, which introduces a rifle.
Kid might as well pick up where they left off.
After some practice dispatching some enemies at range, the tension ramps up. Each level is well paced in this regard at the very least, but this is done for almost every single level. With every new weapon that gets introduced, the game needs to teach you how to use it. Every stage therefore is a kind of tutorial for a particular weapon. It made me wonder, at what point is the player supposed to choose which weapon combinations work best for them? The answer to that question comes in the form of some key items that are found as the game progresses.
Poor kid collapses after just 1 drag.
With these items, players unlock memory arenas that allow the player to experiment to their heart's content. In exchange for doing these combat challenges, you earn more details about the characters that are associated with these items, and more fragments and experience points. There was diligence in not allowing these areas to work as XP farms, but the unfortunate downside is that they also don't provide much incentive in doing them more than once. And no new information is provided no matter how many times you complete them.
Fair to say he's led a hard life. Supposing what he says in his sleep ain't no lie.
Once you get the core on a stage, there's no reason to go back to it. At least that's what the game suggests. The plot reason is that the core is what's keeping that stage intact. But considering that memories are a thematic motif of the story anyway, I don't see why a contextual reason couldn't be justified to allow players to return to past stages to explore the environments. It's an efficient but inelegant way to move the story along. It's a shame because they all look gorgeous, and a lot of work went into making each area look and feel more distinct from the last. Backtracking would interrupt the pace of the storytelling, but it prevents the player from improving their skills on particular challenges. A potential exception to this could have been the Proving Grounds, as they already are unique challenges for your weapons. Of course, completion of the Proving Grounds also results in getting those areas closed off. The camera placement is its own double-edged sword. The combination of the distant camera and visually busy environments don't allow for a lot of details to come through in the heat of the moment. A fixed camera can solve a lot of problems if the visuals are clear enough, but common enemies such as the squirts, scumbags, and turrets for example, are not able to telegraph their attacks like other enemies. This might be obvious because of their general concept, but their attack animations are limited to a small part of their bodies, restricting the utility of the defensive mechanics. Since the face is the key to defend against the scumbags, if a scumbag is turned facing away from the camera, the player can't anticipate it and defend or dodge the attack in the same way you're able to with the large, anticipated swings of the gas fellas. As the camera remains stationary from the fixed perspective, visual cues cannot be relied upon when those small details are the key to combating certain enemies. On the one hand, the isometric viewpoint can ensure that all relevant information remains on screen. This is why Bastion depends on large, slow, minimal movements for the enemies. Even with that precaution, enemies can still spawn outside of the screen's viewable area, having to rely on the ranged weapon's auto-aim to see where they are. This seems like an oversight. For me, a stage that seems to balance the combat with the visuals the best reveals itself in the second half of the game. Ruthless Lagoon culminates in a boss fight with an ankle gator, whose moves are telegraphed clearly, its position can always be seen, and with the right timing can be made to reveal itself for an attack. The fight does not include many other enemies that might distract or interrupt attacks, aside from the odd stationary cactus. With how short many of the levels tend to be, it's not long before the entirety of the Bastion is rebuilt. Once the Bastion is rebuilt, it's apparent that there simply isn't a lot to it. One shop is a lost and found. Any items you miss can simply be purchased, undercutting any desire a player might have to explore stages outside the beaten path. The existence of this structure concedes to the fact that it's impossible to repeat stages or backtrack. That is to say, exploration can be circumvented if you know ahead of time that you can simply buy any items you miss at the lost and found. It's a solution to a problem the game developers created themselves. More fragments can be earned by turning in vigils at the memorial, which houses essentially in-game achievements. Some seem rather arbitrary and menial, but many are completed by playing the core stages of the game anyway. Fragments are also left behind on completed stages. Being one of the few instances where exploration is encouraged, this is a necessary compromise in case players are just short on currency to shop for certain upgrades. The shrine serves to boost your income potential by invoking the gods and providing an extra challenge. To me, the shrine is the most significant addition to the Bastion, outside of the first three structures. It provides the player with another degree of agency, one that doesn't change until the player decides to change it. By contrast, there wouldn't be much of a need for the Lost and Found, or the Memorial, if the player could return to past stages. The last thing anyone wants to do in an action game is to grind, and this is probably the reason why these buildings work this way. But to a certain degree they promote speedrunning, or completing arbitrary tasks, over engaging with the environments that are so fleshed out.
Proper story is supposed to start at the beginning. It's so simple with this one.
Bastion begins in medias res, which is a fancy Latin term, meaning the events we see unfolding before us are actually occurring after the story really begins. Functionally, the plot starts long before the kid even gets involved. After encountering Zulf in the Hanging Gardens, a missionary from the east, the player learns about the tumultuous history between his people, the Ura, and the Ceylondians. Another stage gives way to another supporting character, Zia, singing in the ruins of Prosper Bluff. You learn that she is also an Ura, but was raised by Ceylondians. I admit, tumultuous is a pretty understated way of putting things. This narrative is more or less a facsimile for many relationships between colonials and native peoples throughout recorded history. Look it up if you feel like it. Zulf's big discovery after reading Zia's journal leads him to justifiably destroy the monument at the center of the Bastion, because the Bastion was the final solution intended to end the Ura once and for all.
The calamity failed, he says, but I will not.
This is a substantial revelation and marks a turning point in the story and to a certain extent the gameplay. It provides a new context for everything you've achieved thus far. The added narrative tension for the second half of the game allows it to introduce new enemy types in new areas. The latter stages also introduce the first human enemies, which are a little more complex in their attack patterns and require even more precise timing than the monsters. These human enemies are the remaining Ura tribe, who Zulf warns of the impending resurrection of the Bastion, and are determined to stop you. In doing so, they damage the Bastion once more, and the final levels move the kid forward into Ura territory. It really shows here that the challenge in Bastion comes in trying to manage so many different enemies and obstacles on screen at once with limited information. I feel for anyone who completely upgraded their weapon loadouts, because it matters very little leading up to the climax. The final stage disregards any of the items collected thus far, deferring to a battering ram that one-shots everything. Zulf's warning backfires and the Ura turn on him, leaving him for dead. If you were to do the math, there are a total of 4 endings. Not bad for a game of this scope. The first branch of these choices begins with the first 2, to save Zulf and carry him back to the Bastion, or to leave him behind and destroy the remaining Ura tribe. They are both touching and impactful in their own ways. If you are pragmatic but spiteful, you might have continued with your path of destruction, The kid's compassion towards Zulf as the Aura watch on was surprising, and my personal favorite ending. When players make choices in games, the expectation is that the choice is final, and respected by the game. Then the game usually prevents the player from changing their mind. Another expectation is that the choice will carry over into other choices. Quest givers no longer give quests if they're dead or they hate you, for example.
It reminds me of myself when I was his age. I ever tell you about those days?
When I made the choice to carry Zulf's body, I expected that to carry over into the next scene in some significant way, considering the strong reaction from his former tribe. As I explored all of the endings, I saw that there was no difference with the later choices at all.
It reminds me of myself when I was his age. I ever tell you about those days?
Even everything that Rux and Zia tell the kid before making the final choice to restore Caelondia or move on are exactly the same. Zulf's presence grants no reaction from them. It led me to think about the intent of this in the first place. The developers insist upon the role-playing mechanic of granting players choices, and this inclusion stems from that. The choice is to act on the player's own feelings against the Ura. Love thine enemy, or destroy them. In some ways this is pretty bold, and the game doesn't try to impress upon a specific choice. The choice is the players to make alone. But the results treat each choice exactly the same. The xenophobic player is granted the same options as the empathetic one. It isn't that one choice should necessarily be punished by granting it less options, but when afforded the same results as the other, it diminishes the impact of both.
Welcome to the heart of the Bastion.
The secondary endings are equally optimistic depending on your point of view, represented by Rux and Zia as they offer their takes on each option. Rux seems keen on restoring Caelondia, hopeful that things might have turned out differently, but also considering his age, he may feel like he doesn't have much of a future in the post-calamity world. Zia, on the other hand, seems optimistic that a new world could be made in any image they see fit. I can understand her point of view considering she sort of exists between the two worlds. Perhaps she doesn't see a point in starting over, or dwelling on what might have been seems counterproductive.
Any moment I'd want to live again happened after the calamity, not before.
Only one of these secondary options makes the most sense if you're legitimately role-playing and have already made up your mind. Given a player's point of view based on the first choice with Zulf, one option might be a non-starter compared to the other. An anti-Aura stance may not care for their existence at all. So the freedom ending may be preferable to their resurrection, considering how many get slaughtered by the end of the game. But the sympathetic player might want to give everyone a clean slate. On paper, 4 endings sounds pretty sweet. More bang for your indie game dollar. But in actuality, there are only 2 endings, or rather 2 climaxes to the story. The choices between Rux and Zia do conclude the story, but since the preceding decision actually challenges the player's feelings about the Ura and Zulf, that remains the true climax to the player's journey through Bastion. Everything after that decision is denouement and resolution. At the very least, they both provide some food for thought. If I were to rank the elements that define Bastion's focus, it would go story first, action gameplay second, and then role-playing. The narration is probably the most important evidence of how the game's focus on story presents itself, in addition to the brevity of its levels and de-emphasis on exploration. I know I've been ragging on the lack of exploration, and I bring up the division between player choice and the game's design a lot, because an action RPG was the developer's stated intention with Bastion from the beginning. Supergiant's pedigree includes former developers of the Command & Conquer and Red Alert games. I can respect the choice to branch out to explore new ideas. Bastion is likely not a game that these people might have been able to make under the EA umbrella, if the last decade or so has been anything to go by. As a small game developed by a small studio, Bastion's restraints can be both a blessing and a curse. There's some elegance in the efficiency of its storytelling, but there are many places where the gameplay choices undermine its intentions, especially when new items get introduced as you play for the first time. Having so many weapons to choose from can be great for player choice. However, the implementation of a new one every other stage tends to serve the opposite purpose, considering each level showcases a particular weapon's strengths. That's not really a choice when it's both forced upon the player and a foregone conclusion at the same time. Almost every step of the way, the RPG in Action RPG disappears. Where they strive toward the action elements, they succeed for the most part, but the roleplay elements are diminished to a degree where they are almost unnecessary. By the end of my first playthrough, I reached level 6. Shelves at the distillery unlock as the kid levels up, which has a maximum of 10 shelves. While 6 out of 10 levels seems pretty well paced for a first run, the XP bar doesn't necessarily need to be there. The utility of XP is only used to unlock those passive perks that could just as easily be unlocked through exploration, just like the weapons. Storytelling and action gameplay aren't bad things to put focus on by any means, but it's hard to really classify Bastion as an RPG at all. In places where the game suffers, it doesn't suffer much or for very long. The game itself is relatively short, and the Proving Grounds and Dream sequences are great moments to explore the combat systems and characters more thoroughly if you so choose. Even among other indie titles and studios that have cropped up to emulate Bastion and Supergiant's success, it still stands out as an example of what can be done with a clear enough vision and a little freedom. Perhaps there might be another timeline where Bastion could have realized its whole potential. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you like this video, please consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.